Chapter 961. Lurkers of the Dark. Ghouls, zombies, creatures of the lurking night of all shapes and sizes. Some took shape as large as trolls, half their faces replaced by their oozing brain matter falling out from their skulls. Some were in the shape of beasts, wolves with forked tongues and birds with an odd number of wings. The scent of rotting death filled the air, concentrating into larger and larger plumes of darkness. However, Silas was focused on something else. They're all level 0, average physical, mental, and were all around 5 or 5,000 by Earth's current stat system. This wasn't what Silas expected. He had honestly expected them all to be level 50. If not for the fact he had Go-Go, he would have never stepped foot in here. But what he didn't know was that City Stellae challenges would not only slow ramp up, the real reason they were so difficult was because of the grade, not the level. The level was decided by the person that triggered the challenge. The grade, however, was decided by the grade of the City Stellae. How many level 0s had Silas met on Earth that had an average of 5,000 stat points? The answer was technically 0, because he was the only one he could think of. And that was because this challenge was set to bronze. While that didn't mean that every demon that appeared would be at the bronze grade, they would be close. This first wave represented what the weakest of near bronzes could manage, but there would be elites soon, and then the final boss of the wave. If he didn't finish clearing wave 1 by the time the timer ran out, wave 2 would be summoned at the same time regardless of how many he had cleared, and they would be even more powerful. Maybe by the time he got to the last waves, there might likely be creatures that dwarfed Go-Go in stats. Go-Go was registered as a Gold King beast right now, but after unlocking his second gene lock, Silas knew that that grade didn't reflect just how much suppression the Basilisk King was suffering. But this is much easier than I thought it would be. Silas didn't move, and yet, bang, bang, bang. One head after another began to explode, his telekinesis bearing down on them with such force that the defenses couldn't even remotely hold up. There was a time dilation on this world, but it wasn't enough. From what he could sense from his progenitor flame ability, it was only about 10 times or so, meaning 24 hours was around 2¼ hours. If he spent that amount of time on every wave, he would run into his 3-day deadline for sure. Plus, the Madness Key didn't care about time dilations. All it cared about was the time he personally experienced. That meant that these waves, they had to go. And they had to go now. A ring of destruction formed around Silas. His will had always been the most effective against creatures of the dark. Now, it was even more exaggerated. They couldn't fight back against his gaze weaving into their bodies, shattering their skulls from the inside out. The most shocking part was that Silas hardly felt a drain on his will at all. In fact, any he used recovered faster than he could even use it. It almost felt like he was gaining will in exchange for using it. A demon coin is 100 kills. Silas crossed the mark and felt a tick-up notification pop. When he glanced at it, he noticed that he had gained his first demon coin. He hadn't been counting the exact number of demons he had killed, but 100 should be about right. This was unexpected. He had been thinking it might be 1, or maybe 10. But this. It seems that there are far more enemies than I thought, Silas' gaze flashed. Single quote ellipsis. Faster, then. Silas picked up the pace. He split his telekinesis into 10 parts. This was about his limit right now. Although he could split it more ways, this was the only way he could maintain his will at peak condition. Right now, he left madness toggled off. Now that it was at common, it took even more stamina to use. Plus, he didn't need the boost. Not yet. But he could feel that more powerful creatures were coming. As the wave continued, and the more he killed, the more strength the creatures began to have. And then the first elite appeared. Silas sensed it before the ether circle around it had even fully formed, his telekinesis locking onto the region. There was a dense light of emerald in his eyes as he pulled on his ether for the first time. He raised a finger, aiming for a distance over a kilometer away. Bang! The timing was perfect. The ether circle of protection had only just vanished when a finger of green wool descended from the skies, smashing the creature to pieces. Silas exhaled a breath. If he had a choice to upgrade his unique genes right now, Etherflow would definitely be the first. But unfortunately, he had no slots for silver genes left. Not until he integrated his current ones into his foundation to prepare for an E-grade evolution. But while he had raised himself to level 50, that didn't mean he was ready to throw all caution to the wind for speed of advancement just yet. That decision, though, would have to wait until he crushed everything here in his path. Scylla's finger flexed as one elite after another began to form. They were larger, armored in black, foggy armor. They made the trolls from earlier seem like dwarfs by comparison. Scylla's finger trembled, his claw extending just the slightest bit as he activated Primate Swipe. Like a judgment from a god above, 10 fingers manifested in a swirling mass of illusory green, each one with a claw as sharp as the last. Then his arm descended. Bang! Chapter 962. 139. Scylla's had felt limited by etherflow for a long while now, but at the moment, it didn't seem to matter in the slightest. His illusory claws ripped through their bodies, his projected constitution more than bolstered by his wool and his scorned wraps. Their bodies shattered to pieces. But in focusing on killing these elites in one sweep, the rest of the wave had quickly closed in the distance. Scylla's was just one man, and though he was only defending a single location, there were too many ways to wrap around him if the situation became dicey. He definitely needed more support, but until now he had only gathered 10 or so demon coins. Scylla's gaze flashed. 21. I see, so the elite are worth 1 each. It might even be the case that the later waves are worth even more. Scylla's hadn't known the names of all of the serpentists he took in, but he could recognize them by the names nonetheless. Many of them, especially those near the top of the list, could be exceptionally powerful. There were several FF plus creatures that cost in the several hundred coins, and even some at FFF and above that cost in the tens of thousands. If he could summon the latter group already, he would do so. But if he wasted coins on the weaker ones now, unless he could buy them in bulk, he would just be sending them to their death. The Bronze City Stele Challenge creatures were too strong. Although they didn't have the grades on them, they were definitely at least FF, and it would only get worse from here. If only. Unfortunately, Scylla's had only grasped his beast totem enough to use Beacon, but its other abilities, such as boosting his contracts, were still beyond him right now. Not unless he could gain 5 million silver genes to unlock Vipermancy. Scylla's took a breath, spreading out 2 hands. His palms glowed, and then 2 illusory palms appeared in the distance as large as small hills. They grabbed out, gripping the legs of 2 trolls that must have been at least 10 to 15 meters tall. His grip tightened, their rotting, but extraordinarily tough skin deforming beneath his strength. Even as corpses, their heft hadn't changed. Each one easily weighed at least 40,000 pounds. Scylla's telekinesis ripped him up from the ground. Bang! One arm descended at a distance. Using the dead troll as a smashing hammer, he crushed a large segment of the left wing of the army. He raised his right hand, then smashed down again. Bang! Scylla's unleashed absolute carnage. The constitution remained intact after death for far too long, and these elite rotting trolls were too elite in this respect compared to the rest of the army. With a booming, almost rhythmic cadence, the bodies of the 2 trolls rammed against their once allies, smashing them to the ground in pieces. With the current strength of his telekinesis, Scylla's could have picked up more of them, but he didn't for 2 reasons. The first reason bore out quite quickly. He smashed their bodies so hard, and so repeatedly, against enemies that were also trying to destroy them, that though he pushed back the dangerous line further and away from the hill he was protecting, their bodies crumbled apart. When the hip of one troll separated from its leg after a particularly violent swing, Scylla's didn't even hesitate. He unclenched his palm, dispersing his illusory hand. He gripped at the air again and a new wave of etherflow took shape, picking up another elite and continuing the process. As for the second reason, it was because when his body mimicked the actions of his telekinesis, etherflow was much more powerful, adding his own stats to the power of the blow. This was why he punched out when using etherflow instead of just using his mind to form a fist. And it was also why he raised both hands high into the skies, smashing down with all his might. A rippling power came from his back and the flex of his abs, his canines flashing as he roared. Boom! The last 2 troll bodies looked like they had imploded on impact, their bodies scattering into a mess of flesh and blood that wasn't just their own. The foul scent in the air hung heavier, but then a satisfying notification echoed. Wave 1 cleared. Time to wave 2, 0 hours 0 minutes and 59 seconds, 59. Silas took a breath and then exhaled. Demon coins, 139. There had only been 20 or so elites in the end, not including the boss that appeared at the end that had been worth 2 demon coins. But honestly, the boss wasn't strong enough for Silas to treat it much differently than the others at all. The stats of the creatures didn't seem much different. Rather, the elites and the boss had better reactions, more effectiveness, and stronger skills and gene skills to rely on. Regardless, Silas killed them from so far away that they didn't even have a chance to cast them on him. And all this aside, the main point here was that the first wave had almost 1200 enemies. If the gap in strength and ranged abilities wasn't so great, he wouldn't have made it so far at all. It's going to make me wait here for an hour no matter what. Silas shook his head. Although he knew there was a time dilation, he didn't like the wasted time. He looked back toward the city he was supposed to be protecting. He bet that he could also upgrade some of its abilities with the demon coins he gathered. But no. Silas looked toward his list of potential summons. After calculating a few things, he made his decision. He spent all of his demon coins on 3 and 4 demon coin summons. There were about 40 of them in the end, and each one radiated a dense ice ether. Silas closed his eyes and began to communicate with them. In this 1 hour, he was going to teach them all a single skill. Chapter 963. Adaptation. Wave 2, Covenant of the Wild. Time to wave 3, 0 hours 23 minutes and 59 seconds, 59. Silas opened his eyes, a frosty aura radiating out from the serpentis around him. He gave the wave name a glance and frowned. Something told him that these names were more important than they seemed. A part of him had thought that this was because he was reading them in ancient Ithkal and maybe overthinking it. But now he felt it even more substantially than he had during the first wave. Unfortunately, there were no answers sitting around waiting for him. Ether circles began to form one after another, humanoids appearing one after another. They moved as though they were apes, their knuckles pressing against the ground and their heels grinding into the dirt as they leapt and lunged forward in a laboring gait. Their faces were covered by bone-carved, feathered masks. And quite frankly, they didn't look threatening in the slightest. The tallest of them was barely 5 feet 6 inches to 5 feet 7 inches or so. With them crouching like that, they looked even smaller in stature. They lacked menacing claws, and given how poorly their bodies were constructed for the current form of movement, it looked as though they were presenting themselves for death. Their stats were all around 6 or 7,000, but their effectiveness was in the tank. Something is wrong. The humanoids were rushing forward, the beast skins that covered their lower bodies swaying with their odd movements. They looked like jokes. The humanoids were rushing forward, the beast skins that covered their lower bodies swaying with their odd movements. They looked like jokes. It was like they were insane asylum humans that had just broken free from their restraints. But Silas knew that something had to be up. There was no way the system would give him such an easy victory. He thought about commanding his serpentis to act on the plan he had formed before, but he changed his mind. With a stomp of his foot, he rushed ahead. It was as he said. Strength alone wasn't enough. He would become all-powerful and all-knowing. The first part to the latter was trusting his deductive abilities and being inquisitive. Bang! Silas ignored the swarming humanoids for just one. He only gently used his telekinesis to continuously push them away every time they got close. He began an exchange with just one of them. In just the first 3, he found that he could have killed him 3 separate times already. It had to be known that Silas wasn't even using his Scorpion Warlord armor right now. His stats weren't even 10% of the humanoids. So why the hell was it so weak? And then he felt the change on the 4th exchange, then the 5th. Oh, Silas' eyes blazed with light. Fascinating, fascinating. Adaptation. By the 4th exchange, there was a substantial change to the danger the humanoid posed to him. In terms of power itself, nothing changed. But Silas sensed the tick-up in warning signs from his luck. It's not just it. Silas' gaze focused on the others around him. They were learning as well. Finally, he understood what the trap of his wave was. If he just rushed in, going all out to kill them as quickly as possible, these tribal humans would adapt, their strength morphing and changing in effectiveness. If he was correct, they might even reach a point by the end of the wave that rather than their effectiveness being far beneath their stats, it was actually the vice versa. My original plan is the absolute worst for this situation. Silas frowned inwardly, not knowing the limits of this adaptation. If he suddenly shot into the skies, would they learn how to fly too? Or if he killed one, would they adapt to be resistant to that form of death? What if he used his telekinesis from a distance? Would their will grow more powerful to suffocate his attempts and force him to fight hand to hand? Be strong. Every time, it seemed to circulate right back to that. But this time, Silas was stubborn. He didn't believe that there was no way to deal with this intelligently. There is a way. There is a way. He spoke the first set of words, but it was the ape-crawling humanoid before him that spoke the second. They were even trying to learn his language. Silas had only said these words out loud because he was reassuring himself that he would find a method. He didn't expect to receive a reply. Is that so? Is that so? The humanoid seemed to have lost the inflection of the question. Silas suddenly accelerated. Before the humanoid could react, his scorpion warlord armor took shape and his claws ripped through its chest. He could already sense that the enemies he was softly keeping away from his telekinesis were slowly beginning to struggle free easier and easier. But he had, indeed, found a method. Extricate. Silas ripped upward, pulling a unique gene out of the humanoid. It was already fading, and it was clear to Silas that he wasn't meant to be able to collect genes from these people. They were illusions, projections formed by the system. They weren't real. But when the system simulated something, it simulated to the deepest degree. Silas' eyes focused on the vanishing unique gene, ignoring the pelting rain of attacks around him. They had no ability to use their ether, they could only throw rocks at him and scratch at his armor. It was worthless when his current constitution was practically triple their best attack stats. Bronze. Yes, I can do this. Silas' eyes glazed over. He gave the humanoids nothing to latch onto, sensing the feel of his runeweaver profession. The link between his rune spark, progenitor professional, and new profession linked together, and he had gained a natural understanding of how to unravel runes. Silas mumbled beneath his breath as the attacks he was suffering began to grow heavier and heavier. His armor was already showing signs of cracking, but with how many attacks he was suffering, it was only natural. There. Silas' eyes flashed open. He raised his head to the skies and roared out a long string of words. The humanoids blinked and began to copy him. And then they froze as they got to the syllable. Bang! The first of them imploded. Bang! And then came the second. Bang! And then the third. Like firecrackers resonating across concrete, they popped again and again, seas of them dying in quick succession. Chapter 964. Coincidence. Silas watched as they all died one after another. The blood fell in a rain, his gaze sweeping over them one after another. So, something like this is possible too. What Silas had done wasn't actually all that complicated, at least not to him. The unique gene of these humanoids was very firmly ingrained into their bodies. Every time it sensed something that it had to adapt to, it would trigger, and then holistic changes would occur to their entire being. All Silas had done was distill the unraveling abilities of his pupils into a series of ancient ithcal syllables. He hardly had to think to deduce it at all. The ability to unravel runes came as naturally as breathing to him. Obviously, the main issue was that while the unique genes weren't close to the 100 foundation peak that came from F-grade runes, they were drawn by the system, and as such nearing the pinnacle of perfection. This made them harder to unravel than usual, to be sure. But the rune itself only had 20 foundations. As powerful as the system was, it wasn't to the point that it could make a 20 foundation rune bulletproof. If it could, even the likes of Extricate wouldn't work on them. Once Silas understood the principles of unraveling the rune, it was a simple matter of repeating what he had done with Gogo's true name, except orders of magnitude easier. Rather than an entire textbook's worth of words and syllables to spill, it was a breeze by comparison. When the humanoids repeated the words he said, they didn't know it, but they were essentially triggering the formation of a rune that perfectly counted the core of their bodies themselves. Ultimately, runes were just another language, drawing them, speaking them, communicating them. It was all the same so long as the universe or the mesh of reality understood what you were trying to get at and you had enough ether to trigger its formation. It was all as simple as that. Can I replicate this? Wave 2 cleared. Time to wave 3, 0 hours 0 minutes and 59 seconds, 59. Silas stood there for a while, knowing he had time. After a long while, he shook his head. The first and most obvious reason this wouldn't work again was because how often would he fight against identical, replicated enemies? Even amongst those of the same race, especially if one had their unique gene passed down through birth and heredity, every gene would have unique mutations and differences to them. All Gwiz might share the same unique gene, but they wouldn't be identical. It was hard to say if such a method would work on more than one. And if he had a Gwiz unique gene to study, the person he wanted dead would, well, already be dead. After all, he couldn't use extricate on living and unwilling subjects. Though, to be fair, Silas had already observed a Gwiz unique gene before. But there was a second issue. That because of the fact this unique gene was a special circumstance. Because it was so broad in scope and abilities, adapting to anything thrown at it, it was distilled through the entire body. A change to it would mean death for the subject in question. But other unique genes might not be so easy to target. Then there was the third reason. Why would anyone but these stupid enemies repeat the words Silas was saying of their own volition without understanding what he was saying? But, this is interesting, I wonder. Silas' thoughts churned, but eventually he pressed them down. Demon coins, 278. He had gained more demon coins now than before by far, even though the wave was about the same size. As he expected, the later waves were worth more. These names, though. Silas shook his head again. Thinking was good, but only if he had enough information. Other than that, he would just be wasting time. There aren't enough of the Ice Affinity Serpentis left to use up all my demon coins. Silas chose to summon what was left of them and then looked toward the city to see if he could find anything interesting. It would be foolish of him to completely ignore it if he had the time to check it out. As expected, most of the available upgrades were for increased defenses. There were some more expensive ones for buffs for allies and debuffs for enemies, but even the cheapest of them was 100 or so demon coins to exchange for. The worst part was that many of these upgrades worked with a skill tree system. He couldn't trigger some without upgrades to other regions. There was no doubt that this was a tough challenge, to be sure. Balancing how much to upgrade this city versus how many allies to summon. This was probably where the city management aspects came to play, albeit just to a small extent. The buffs are interesting. If I want to upgrade it to trigger the first 10% buff, I need to raise the walls to a tower level, and that'll require 150 demon coins in total. Then an additional 120 for the buff for 270 total. Right now, he only had a little over 100 demon coins left. He couldn't even complete the first leg of the requirements. Is there really no way to increase the number of demon coins I gain? Silas shook his head, just memorizing the entire skill tree of upgrades. It was best to know it now rather than later. Wave 3, Acrid Bellies. Time to Wave 4, 0 hours 23 minutes and 59 seconds, 59. Silas smelled it in the air before it even came. If he was that sort of person, he might have grinned. Serpentis. It seemed he wouldn't have to use his army just yet once again. The system had been nice enough to give him 2 easy victories in a row. With a flash of his eyes, the Serpentis couldn't even move. He slaughtered them with ease. For a moment, Silas almost felt that there was truly nothing special about the Bronze City Stellae trials at all. But he would never be foolish enough to let down his guard like that. Not as the fourth wave took form. Wave 4, Misty Peaks. Time to Wave 5, 0 hours 23 minutes and 59 seconds, 59. Mist. Silas' eyes narrowed as he thought of Lorien. He thought it was a coincidence until it became very much not. Chapter 965. Debut. Silas didn't know much about the Mist race. Or, more accurately, he didn't know much about their socio-economic issues in terms of their placement in the wider Sky Galaxy. But he had lost to Lorien, and her ranking listed her race very clearly, so how could he not have looked into it? He might not have the same hatred for her that he had for Ulrich, but what he did have was a fierce competitive spirit. In his life, Silas couldn't remember losing very often, at least not when he put his mind to something. It was one thing to lose to someone far superior in strength, and maybe Lorien could have been classified in this way. He just didn't agree. There was no doubt that this was ridiculous, but this was just how he saw things. He would defeat her with his own strength at the soonest opportunity. Unlike the Thriskai, the Mist race were actually barely stronger than the human race of the Sky Galaxy. Although they were of the E grade in race as well, they were below even the Sylphs. The main issue they faced was that it was hard to progress. The unique gene caused changes to their body that caused women to be birthed 60% of the time, leading to a heavy imbalance in their population. To match this, they had a change in culture where the strongest women amongst them strategically married outside of their race in hopes of fixing this imbalance. This part of the story Silas could mostly guess. That was because there was no reason for Lorien to be chosen out of the sea of rune masters to purposely lose to Ulrich. Obviously, Lorien had been pursuing Ulrich hard for his genes, and this caused the Thriskai to believe that she could be trusted. But Silas saw Lorien's true face during their battle. With their will bared to the world, there was nothing that she could hide from the man right across from her. He sensed her sharpness, her ambition, her grit. In all respects, she was a respectable woman. It was just that he didn't care. Billowing misty clouds of pink and violet rolled across the ground, one ether circle after another taking shape. "Stay," Silas said calmly. Bang! The ground beneath his feet compressed, his scorpion warlord armor blooming with life and vitality. He wanted to fight this battle himself. With a flex of his bicep, Silas' claw arched from a downward position, slashing up in a wide curve. The face of a Mist race member was split into ribbons. From the back, their head looked just fine. But from the front, it looked like a sea of blood and shredded flesh. Silas stepped by her, his shoulder brushing against her body. She was sent spiraling, slamming out to the side and taking out a river of Mist race existences. The path of the Mist race was heavily reliant on the woolen souls. Most often, this manifested into illusion abilities, but this wasn't all that they could do. Though they were known to be weaker than the Sylphs, their ability to deconstruct their bodies into amorphous, wispy forms was far superior. But their strongest method, and the root of their unique gene, was their Mist manifestation. This was a manifestation of their will, and it was akin to etherflow on a whole other level. This was probably one of the core reasons Silas lost so resoundingly to Lorien. But this wave wasn't formed of Lorien's. Silas rampaged, his blood pumping through his veins. His fists ripped through bodies and his claws severed heads from shoulders. A single kick shattered a skull with such force that its fragments pelted into the face and chest of another, riddling them with holes as though shrapnel from a grenade. The Mist manifestations couldn't even begin to touch Silas. He didn't even use his will to deal with them at all. The moment they came into contact with the wool of his scorpion warlord armor, the residual aura of a scorpion shattered them to pieces. From what Silas could tell, the normal grunts were barely at tangible will. The elites that were only now starting to pop up were at sparking. It just wasn't enough. Bang! Steam emitted from Silas' mouth, his gaze becoming calmer and calmer the more he killed, as though a raging flame inside of him was finally being satiated. His demonic will had truly not flared up in a long while. The last time was when he suppressed it in the face of the Florineth. Did he hate Nissa? No. Did he hate what she represented? Absolutely. Another stain, another moment of weakness. He hated them with every fiber of his being. It made it even worse that this was permanently entrenched into his story, a stamp that would forever be part of the foundation that helped him to grow. And he couldn't get rid of it. Silas roared, punching out with a violence that came from the core of his being. In that moment, the illusory fist that emitted from his arm looked almost as though it had taken true, solid form, crossing the skies and shattering the bodies of every Mist race member it even remotely came into contact with. For others, this wave should have been difficult. But to Silas, it was nothing more than a joke, a place to vent. These Mist race members had all of their stats concentrated into their will and mental stats. Their bodies were barely at 2,000 and 3,000. To them, Silas' body was like a rumbling truck that had already built up all its momentum, crashing into them one after another, while their will couldn't even touch him. But then the boss appeared. Silas sensed the difference the moment the ether circle began to spin, rotating like a cyclone in the dense mist. Is that so? Feeling the wool, Silas faced the pair of eyes in the distance, the mist so dense he couldn't see the rest of them. Still not enough. Silas reached out a hand, and gripped down on the air. The head of the boss shattered before they even made the debut. Chapter 966. Really? Wave 4 cleared. Time to Wave 5, 0 hours 0 minutes and 59 seconds, 59. Silas exhaled a breath, checking the state of his body. He wasn't reckless to the point of putting himself at a disadvantage for later waves just for the sake of his ego. This time, the smartest thing to do was preserve his will. Using telekinesis on the mist race would have cost far more than it had against the rotten creatures that had no defenses against it. In this case, killing them with his hands was the far more efficient method. It also saved him from having to use the method he was slowly building up once again. After some thought, Silas used his demon coins to upgrade the walls and activate the 10% buff. Oh, not bad. 10% didn't feel like a lot, but a holistic overhaul to his stats was huge. A 10% increase to his will, for example, was an entire 2,000 stat points in Earth's old system. For a long while, Silas had relied on the plus 10% stat boost the Scorned Raps gave him. It had been useful for a very long time and saved him quite a number of times even though it was only concentrated onto his fists. I guess next I should try to aim for the ether replenishment buff. Demon coins, 346. This was how many he had left after buying the buff, but if he wanted the ether replenishing buff, he would need 3 times this amount. And if he wanted to upgrade his baseline buff from 10% to 20%, he would need twice the ether replenishment cost. For now, Silas chose to recover what stamina he had used and relax, not buying more summons for the time being. His army had grown to just over 50 or so, and this would be enough for what he wanted to do. Now it was just a matter of waiting. The hour came and went quickly. Any stamina that Silas had used up had long left. With how high his constitution was, not to mention the boost from the Scorned Raps, it barely took a few minutes. The intensity of the battle, given how weak the bodies of the enemies were, he could have easily kept up for an entire day or two. But it was valuable nonetheless. His grasp of the mist race and their abilities was now a solid mass in his mind. He would be ready when he saw Lorien next. Wave 5, Great Simian Rampage. Time to Wave 6, 0 hours 23 minutes and 59 seconds, 59. Silas blinked when he saw Wave 5. Silas blinked when he saw Wave 5. The first wave was rotten creatures. Their wills were 0 by default, and without a master to control them, they were exceptionally weak to Silas' telekinesis. He could even form his telekinesis pulses within their bodies, shredding them from the inside out. The second wave was trickier, but ultimately it only took him a few moments to figure out how to kill them all with nothing more than a few words spoken. The third wave was a sea of serpentis. They were lucky that their bodies were illusory and he had to kill them all, otherwise, he would have gained an entire army for nothing at all. The fourth wave, not only did it teach him about his worst enemy, but it was impossibly easy for someone with forged will. He could have just stood there and they wouldn't even be able to dent his armor. And now. The fifth wave was an army of monkeys. He had yet to even break a sweat. He was still waiting for the challenge to get hard, for it to push him to his limits. All things considered, things were getting harder. The mist race might have had weak bodies, but their mental stats were all in 5 figures, crossing the 10,000 mark just barely by Earth standards. It was just that was still half of Silas' will, even not accounting for the gap in will quality. But this. Silas unlocked a title with his silver genes. Glass Monkey Slayer, bronze title. You have slayed a king of monkeys. Hatred of beasts that follow his charge increases, but you fear them not. F-grade monkeys below the glass monkey in rank suffer a minus 50% debuff to all stats when facing you. Since he got this title, Silas had only used it once before. It had saved him much pain when he received the quest to kill Professor Fembroise. But since then, it hadn't been useful again. Until now. A coincidence? No. Once was fine. Twice even. 3, though odd, was acceptable. But 4 times, 5 times now. The monkeys began to appear one after another, their voices filling the air with a savage sort of yipping. And then Scylla's title descended. From having physical stats around 12 to 14,000, they fell to half of that. Once again, Scylla didn't use the army behind him. They were still weak. If he could conserve them, why bother to put them in harm's way when he could rip through this army on his own? This was still much harder than the Mist race. But with his Scorpion Warlord armor activated and the Scorned Wraps, Scylla's constitution was already over 20,000 to begin with. Now, the gap was even greater. Scylla could have rampaged through them like a falling meteor if he wanted to, but he chose to use the opportunity to hone his control over his body until he killed the last one. But then the 6th wave came, leaving him speechless again. Once again, he activated another title. Wave 6, Sea of Red, 8 incarnations. Time to Wave 7, 0 hours 23 minutes and 59 seconds, 59. The Sea of Red were eyes. The 8 incarnations were their legs. It was a sea of spiders. Scylla's Woodland Spider Queen Slayer title activated and they were all debuffed by 20%. While this wasn't as great, and Scylla finally had to use his strategy, it was still far easier than it should have been. The pattern only continued with the 7th wave left Scylla wondering if there should be a limit to favoritism. The wave was of bird beasts. The challenge was obviously their ranged abilities and their ability to fly. By now, if you hadn't upgraded the artillery of your city, you would be screwed. But Scylla could fly. And when he met them in the air, he realized that they were incredibly weak. If they couldn't fly, they wouldn't even remotely be a challenge. But then came the 8th wave. Scylla thought he might finally get a challenge, only for the system to summon a bunch of Breath Master Rune Masters. Even the boss was only at Flesh Mastery. Their rune magic circles couldn't even form before Scylla's eyes. They were crushed even easier than the first wave to the point it seemed pathetic that they even came out. Then there was the 9th wave. By now, the stats were getting ridiculous, being around 20,000 or so on average for the strengths of those in the wave. When he saw them, Scylla thought he might finally face a challenge. Only for their mages to start chanting. Scylla looked up into the skies as black clouds began to accumulate. Really, lightning. Scylla couldn't unlock his class, it still cost way too much. But not only had he had 2 lakhs of time with the previous waves, but he still had his Glassvault comprehension. Was this what it meant to have a progenitor merit? Chapter 967. Poison. Scylla hadn't come across many lightning uses. Other than the Gwiz, if he disregarded the Glassanox, there were just the creatures of the Dustpark dungeon. But he had noticed the same thing from them all. They all struggled to control their lightning. Although the laws of the wider galaxy weren't exactly identical to that of Earth, some constants shifting, some fundamental formulas being warped, it could be said that the general gist of everything was the same. Lightning still flowed from regions of higher concentration to regions of lower concentration, it was still heavily influenced by charge and easily pulled toward positive energy, flowing out from negative. In order to control lightning, most lightning mancies had to use a whole assortment of tricks. But it was just unfortunate for them that none that Scylla had come across had a method more effective than glass. Glass ether was the perfect fusion of ice ether, poison ether, and earth ether. Because of this, it could take advantage of the polarity properties of hydrogen dioxide, and the grounding abilities of the, well, ground. Poison ether seemed to be the odd one out in the bunch, not playing much of a role. But the more Scylla understood runes, the more he understood just how untrue this was. What exactly was poison ether? To a layman human, poison was just something that killed you. It was separated from venom in that it could be inhaled, swallowed, or absorbed through the skin, while the latter had to be injected into the bloodstream through a wound. But in this world, the difference was meaningless as it was encompassed by the singular word of poison. As many poison runes as Scylla had studied, he had an obvious definition. Poison ether was an ether that spread like a cancer, capable of disrupting the structure and function of anything it came into contact with. This was the most fundamental description of what ether was. From here, they began to deviate. Some of them consumed the ether of others and acted to obstruct. Some corrupted the ether it came into contact with and took it over or forced it to act in ways it otherwise wouldn't. Some used a combination of the two. Glassvolt poison, however, well, it was the bridge between ice and earth, forcing a fusion of the two that would normally not occur by breaking down aspects of the two that would clash or disrupt the flow of one another. It controlled. When the poison aspects of his glassvolt ether were in full effect, it turned everything it touched to glass. It was just that Silas rarely used this ability because he didn't feel like he ever had to. Right now, though. Why not? Silas' scorpion warlord armor deepened in color, and then panels of glass began to coat his tail, and then covered the whole of his armor like sheets of real metal. The silvery blue and dark violet played against one another in a beautiful dance as the scorpion warlord tail rose into the skies. Now, Silas said calmly. The army of Serpentis that Silas had slowly been building up finally got their chance to act. They roared, a familiar rune of Frostbane taking shape. One after another, tall, but narrow walls began to appear across the battlefield. The mages in the distance that had begun to summon creatures as the others continued to summon lightning, sent their lightning wolves and bears on ahead, only for them to be obstructed by an ever-growing maze of narrow walls. These walls didn't seem to bother them very much. When directed by the mages, they would just wrap around them. Those that the mages didn't exert full control over smashed through many of them instead. By now, the Serpentis that Silas had summoned were truly far too weak for this battlefield. At best, they could just form these small obstructions and slow the forward progress of the creatures. But from the very start, this strategy of Silas was only meant to do exactly that. He was just one man, constantly facing off against thousands of enemies. It was only natural that he face this sort of hardship. If he could make it just the slightest bit easier, why not? That said, by now, the buffs from his city had also climbed to a full 110%. The Serpentis might still be weak by comparison to the enemies, but what about him? Silas took only a calm, shallow breath before his tail swayed. A beam of silvery blue light left it just as a lightning bear raised its paw to slash down another wall. It was already halfway through the growing maze, and there didn't seem to be more than a kilometer between itself and the city Silas was protecting to his back. But then a glassvolt rune formed to Vitality Mastery pierced into the wall. All of a sudden, the lightning being gathered in the skies rampaged out of control and a bolt fell from above. It all happened so fast that the lightning bear's claw hadn't even fully descended when the wall of what seemed to be glowing snow became a fortress of crystalline glass instead. Bang! Its paw shattered on impact, and most of its lightning ether was immediately sapped out of its body. Silas' tail flickered again and another beam jetted out, and then another. His Serpentis began to form walls faster and faster, and all Silas did was form another rune and send it out. All the ether was being gathered by the mages up ahead for him, and because of the special abilities of the Scorpion Warlord tail, all of the poison runes it manifested were formed to the same level of mastery as the Scorpion Warlord armor itself, so it cost Silas no wisdom to continue drawing them like this. It was a completely one-sided slaughter. Every time Silas thought that the waves couldn't possibly get easier, they did. And then, the 10th and final came. Chapter 968. Glassvolt's Path. Wave 10, Infernal Grove. Final Wave. Infernal Grove. Again, there was something about the name that spoke to Silas, but for very different reasons. This time, he didn't feel like he had some great advantage to take care of, but rather that this peculiar Mansa path. Others who didn't speak a language like ancient Ithkal might not understand what they were seeing, but Silas himself sensed it immediately. The image of an ancient tree burning in the fires of hell popped into his mind. It was a fascinating dichotomy, two halves of ethermancy that should have been completely separate from one another. Wood should have been suppressed by fire, and fire should suffocate wood. But they came together in a balance. Fire, wood, poison. It was like a reflection of his Glassvolt Mansa path, but taken in a completely new and different direction. Fascinating. The wood is like its own representation of the earth element, the fire being its ice, and the poison forcing them together. The poison makes the wood act more like metal, and the fire stimulates it all. Usually, wood could only bloom so much after being burnt to complete ash. It could grow because of the influence of fire, but not in the presence of fire. Somehow, this Mansi path allowed the wood to tap into the rejuvenation aspects of a forest burnt to ash while the fires were still blazing, giving it a great deal of sturdiness and vitality. It made the wood endless, relentless, almost like the undying flame that burned through it. Silas grasped all of this just from the title of the final wave alone, and it made him wonder. If the system were to title his glass vault ether path into a wave like this one, what name would it choose? What secrets would it unfurl before him? Lost in his thoughts, Silas hardly seemed to react as one treant with crowns of black-red fire dancing in the crowns of their canopies appeared after another. Their stats dwarfed 25,000 or so, but this was hardly the worst part of them. Silas could tell even without looking that killing them wasn't so simple. From the title of their wave alone, he knew they were probably worse than undead. And yet, he was still lost in thought. Just what would they title it? What does it represent? And then Silas' heart shook. Throne of Glass Vault Heir. Radiant sparks of lightning triggered in Silas' eyes. The bolts of silvery blue suddenly became emerald arcs instead. I understand. Glass Vault, common, progenitor. The war of earth and sky has been fought for countless millennia. Those that worship the avatars of both are endless, each one leading crusades in their name. But in a distant past, the earth and skies were never such rivals, but rather existed in a resonant hum of camaraderie and balance. Plus 1,250% intelligence. In a single bound, Silas' Glassvault comprehension crossed from legendary mastery to progenitor mastery. And then it took another leap from fragmented to common, evolving completely from its very roots. First class unlocked. Unlock difficulty modified. 10 million silver genes rewarded. It all seemed to flow smoothly from one to the next. Silas read the description of his Glassvault comprehension again, and then watched the system translate it to ancient Ithkal. There was a rhythmic hum that came from his chest, an understanding he hadn't quite grasped until just now. The arcs of emerald sparked around him, glass reflecting the green of his eyes taking shape. He should have seen it before. The glass pinecone had told him everything he needed to know. When he saw those two paths, the depths were obvious. On one hand, there was a glass that reflected the hopes and dreams of the people of his world. On the other, there was glass that reflected the ambition in his heart and the dominance he sought after. He had chosen the latter. What he never considered was what it meant to add lightning to that equation. A part of him didn't even consider them to be related at all. They were never rivals, Silas thought to himself. How could they be rivals when one was always suppressing the other? When one was always the dome, the glass ceiling that one could see through and yet never touch. The description was supposed to be warm, but Silas could feel that same sneering laugh in it, almost like a cute pat on the head you gave a child when they tried their best but failed anyway. If this infernal grove carried the meaning of life and rejuvenation, Silas understood his own path more intimately than ever before now. There had been two before him. In one, he harmonized with the earth and the skies, accepting the strengths of both and reaching a perfect balance. In the other, he stabilized the earth with the steadiness of his stance, grasping at the skies with an open palm and ripping down its arrogance. He took control of the writhing bolts and molded them into his very palms. Emerald lightning sparked with greater and greater fervor. Silas was so lost in his breakthrough that he didn't even seem to notice the first treant appear before him, so distracted that all of his defensive lines had already collapsed beyond repair and creatures impossibly more powerful than his own army were already swarming his city. But then the treant struck down toward him, its blackened claws leaving streaks of flames in the air that crackled with heat. Heat that Silas couldn't even begin to feel. All he could feel was a cool chilliness, a reminder of the loneliness of his path. He exhaled, just the slightest hint of that chill emitting from his lips in a foggy crackle. The treant froze in place, icicles that formed like emerald gems coating its body until it was swallowed whole. A spark of lightning fell from the skies like a green giant's foot, smashing it to pieces. From the start, Silas didn't even move. But black scales had begun to form across his skin. Fusion. Chapter 969. Origin. Standing in a crown of flames as though it could hardly affect him at all, Silas crushed the heart of the treant boss. His eyes still seemed to be somewhat glazed over. After breaking through, he didn't seem to have regained his focus again, still focusing on the feeling that was coursing through him. Truthfully, he didn't even need the Basilisk King right now. It was overkill considering the 110% boost that was coursing through him right now. With the Basilisk King, well, his stats were dwarfing 6 figures right now. In this world, that might have just been 3, but the end result was much the same. Nothing changed. Final wave cleared. Perfect clearance. Silas exhaled another breath, his eyes finally regaining small hints of focus. The lightning around him calmed slightly, but now, weaving through the strands in his evolved eyes, there was a depth of lightning to them. Silas felt that if he wanted to, he could fry someone to ash with just a gaze. His eyes themselves had gained the ability to project lightning. No, it was more like his will had taken the shape of Glassvolt. Now that it was forged, and had found its manifested form, it was like his will had taken another half step forward. The world around Silas warped as his black scales faded away. When his vision cleared, he was standing in a foggy world of black. The only point of light was a cube of complex patterns fitted together like a jigsaw puzzle, descending in a radiant orb of bronze. First city unlocked. Unlock difficulty modified. 3 million silver genes rewarded. Quest leaderboard. 1. Silas Grimblade 14,218,470. 2. Lorien Mist 988,050. 3. Ulrich Vekunish 613,025. 4. Sylvia Page 215,000. An impossible gap to bridge had suddenly opened up. Silas wasn't sure how important that leaderboard was, but what he did know was that it definitely played more of a role than allowing everyone to keep tabs on each other. In an ideal world, he hoped that these silver genes wouldn't just disappear in the end. But he had a feeling that things would never be so easy. But what was important now was that he had gotten his hands on exactly what he needed. Reaching forward, he took the city stele. The world warped around him again, but because he could even decide how to go about the next leg of his plan, there was a change. You have pleased the system. System origin reward received. Silas was taken aback. What did he do this time? He couldn't think of having done anything special. Even upgrading his Glassvolt comprehension was something he had already done with his madness comprehension not long ago. Wait. That was when it clicked for Silas. His madness comprehension wasn't something the system liked. If anything, it would probably prefer for it to be wiped from existence entirely. But his Glassvolt comprehension was something that the system was more than willing to embrace. Could that really be it? Silas had a feeling that he was on the right track, and that he was. The system was always looking to improve. While it was spurring on the evolution of those under its umbrella, it too was trying to grasp methods of improvement. Not being able to bestow legendary comprehensions was a huge issue for it, and it limited the strengths of the races and beings under it greatly. As such, whenever someone not only pleased it, but allowed it to observe an evolution path that could help it refine itself, it granted an origin reward. Origin reward. Greater than Glassvolt Baron, gene class, fragmented. OR. Greater than Throne of Glassvolt Baron, class, legendary. Silas stared at the screen for a long while and then ignored the notification. There was no rush for him to make a decision right now, but he knew that the system was almost certainly giving him another clue. There was a chance to improve a gene class that went beyond just relying on the system to give him a quest for it. If there wasn't, there was no way that the system would try to give him this as a reward. But by the same token, Silas wasn't going to take the chance of losing what stats he had, not yet. He wasn't sure if Glassvolt Baron would weaken his current stats or not. But he knew that he had no way of confirming that. He couldn't risk it. He could accept the reward whenever he wanted, it wasn't going anywhere. Right now, his main task was something else. When Silas' vision cleared, he found that all the Serpentists were around him. His gaze flickered to the Bronze City Stele and he wondered if he should do things here or try to find a better location. After some thought, he made his decision. Using up all of his genes, he unlocked Vipermancer. Once this power was brimming within him again, beacon echoed through the land once more. Then, Silas turned his vision to the Bronze Stele City. Activate Bronze City Stele. Yes, no. Nosfaline. Silas spoke out and the beautiful Clipsian appeared once again. You will be City Lord. Understood. Silas wasn't even sure if this was possible, but he didn't see why not other than the fact Nosfaline wasn't an Overlord race member. But in this world, technically speaking, none of them were. As expected, there was no issue. Nosfaline's body glowed with a bronze light and city structures began to spontaneously form one after another. The rest of you, clear out the region. I want as many genes collected as possible until this area has nothing more to give. Silas thought that it was probably about time he leveled back up to 50. Since his class was unlocked, there was no longer a need to hold back. While his Serpentis gathered the gene cores he needed, he would figure out how to integrate his world treasure with his Bronze City Stellae. Once that was successful, he would end it all. As Silas was moving toward this goal though, the sudden jump to his silver gene total had caused a violent stir. Lorien and Ulrich both stared at the total and they both reached the same conclusion. They couldn't continue with their original plans. Chapter 970 Bridge. Silas sat across from the Bronze City Stellae, his mind the picture of absolute focus. He recalled the information that Nosfaline had gathered from Aurion and Phyx, his world scepter laid out across his lap. The gist of it seemed simple enough. Link the runes of the ether treasure to that of the city Stellae, and soon the ether treasure would gain the ability to bypass the limitation the system had placed on this quest world and display its might properly. Ether treasures were different from normal treasures in that they could interact with the world around them. The reason for the ether prefix was that much of their abilities could be pulled from the external world. In a lot of ways, ether treasures were to treasures what breath mastery runes were to lower tier runes. At breath mastery, runes could pull on the world and gather ether on their own, allowing them to not need the support of other items like special herbs or dyes to give them power. This was the reason why Silas could use his Scorpion Warlord armor without the tattoos Ragnar had once had. It was these runes of the ether treasure that were the target, the very ones that communicated with the surrounding world. Right now, ether treasures were suppressed because the system didn't want external items influencing this world war too much. This world war was supposed to be a measure of the talents of worlds. The world that proved themselves more talented would gain the added support of the system. This was only logical. The system was only interested in improvement. It didn't care through what means, and that was often why the wool could be pulled over its eyes. The system wasn't interested in what was most fair. All it wanted was what could become the most powerful. The irony of that, though, was that those that were already powerful would always have an advantage in that aspect. As heartwarming as it was to root for the underdog, that simply wasn't how the real world worked. So the system needed to strike a balance between betting on the unlikely success and also supporting those that already had the power to, well, support themselves. This was one such case of this. Regardless, what was important was that the system's parameters, in this case, could be circumvented by using the city Stellae. Even so, this was far easier said than done. Other than Lorien and Ulrich, there weren't just an endless supply of rune masters here, so how had they all succeeded in doing this? The runes of a city Stellae weren't nearly as complicated as gene runes, but they were still substantially complex. These were treasures that worlds would fight tooth and nail over. Their number of foundations was uncountable. City Stells, even in their weakest forms, were constructed of a mesh of runes far more complex than even the Scorpion Warlord armor. Ether treasures were somewhat simpler in this respect, but were still complicated nonetheless. Saying that you were easily dealing with 50 foundation rune stacks atop one another wasn't an exaggeration at all. By comparison, the foundations of the runes of the city Stells were probably closer to 80, often even 90. Even Silas had never touched runes of this level. He had been close and even touched 80, but 90? Absolutely not. So how had the others done it? Cheating. Neither Aurion nor Phyx had been able to explain it. That wasn't surprising. Neither was a rune master, and even if they were, Silas doubted they'd have the depth of understanding needed. What they were doing here was mimicking system cities. When Silas first stepped into the depths of a system city, he was taken aback by the large cooling system within it. He thought he had stepped into the core of a large nuclear reactor. This large cooling system provided the system city with a substantial amount of energy as well as support. When the time came, they would even be used to help leap a world over the hurdle, granting it the right to complete the summoning. In this case, all they had likely done was copy those runes, the very ones allowing the city stells to take advantage of the large pool of energy and connect its foundation to the world around it. And by copy, Silas was actually being far too nice. With a wave of a hand, a piece of something that had shattered landed in his hand. It was only a piece of what he had once been, but when the city stellae crumbled, not only had he lost Orion's ether treasure, but what had supported it also collapsed. They hadn't just copied, they had directly taken pieces of a system city to integrate into their contraption. With this as a bridge between the ether treasure and city stellae, and a source of energy, the end result was obvious. Now, understanding this was all well and good, but it wasn't useful to Silas. For one, a world treasure was practically at the same level of complexity as a city stellae. Second, he didn't have a system city available to him here to dissect and form this sort of contraption. And, even if he did, the odds of it working as seamlessly were limited. The reason this could work was because an ether treasure was far inferior to a city stellae. For this system to work properly, one had to be the child, while the other had to be the parent. If the two were too close in strength, the energy wouldn't know which way to flow. That was because this was the definition of a janky system. There were too many things that could go wrong. But as far as Silas was concerned, that was because the rune masters that formed it were far too inferior. They were complete and utter jokes. He squeezed his hand and the piece of system city shattered. Then, he flipped his palm again, and this time, large numbers of energy-filled bottles began to appear. The ground sank. Chapter 971. Easy. Deep impression began to be etched into the ground one step after another as Silas sat there, unmoving. These bottles of energy were from the system cities. As Silas had said when he first came across them, he really didn't have a use for them. He wasn't an elixir maker, nor did he have a usual secondary profession where these things were of great use. But that didn't mean that he would completely abandon them. This energy would one day be used to elevate a world to an entirely different plane. While he could ignore one or two system cities worth of them, he couldn't possibly ignore them all, right? It was almost a shame he had to destroy most of the system cities and couldn't store it all, but he had stored enough. Right now, though, Silas wasn't thinking about this. All he needed was a solid rune platform that could form a link between his world treasure and the city stellae. Even if it meant giving up his world treasure, it was more than worth it. If he didn't, then making it around this world would be far too difficult. At that point, he might as well just wait for the madness key to eat him alive. The process itself, though, was too easy. Silas expected to struggle, to run into some bottleneck, but every moment he spent in this world without the suppression of mutated runes all around him was another day he noticed just how powerful his rune mastery abilities were. Especially when he had a reference to work from. From just the chunks of system city pieces and his memories alone, he was able to construct a perfect rune formation. And, the best part was that he had the Afrocormonics to thank. It had to be remembered that their formation, the very one they used to snatch one of the three pieces of the Genesis Forge, was designed to suppress the system and pull the wool over its eyes. Thanks to it, Silas had been able to form his skill disruption domain skill, and by extension, he was able to pull a ton of useful runes from its body of work as well. Not only did this make forging his bridge from city stellae to world treasure far easier, but also far more powerful. It had to be remembered that it wasn't just the world treasure that was more complicated in this aspect, but the city stellae itself as well. Everyone else here was relying on fragmented city stells, while Silas was using a bronze city stellae. While this was absolutely necessary so that it could withstand the power of a world treasure from Earth, this should have made things doubly more difficult. That was why when Silas opened his eyes, his expression barely moved, it was so shocking. Because it was just as he had said it was. Easy. Lifted by his telekinesis, the bottles of liquid energy uncorked and then pulled forward, seeping into the etched lines on the ground. The radiant blue energy grew more and more concentrated, racing across the lines as though competing with itself. And then the lines began to connect. Ripples of energy spread out in waves as the world treasure on Silas' lap began to rise into the skies. Slowly, the world scepter took its place hovering above the city stellae. Silas stood to his feet. Knowledge, he thought to himself. Single quote ellipsis. If I can accomplish things like this just by knowing it's possible, then my breadth of power would increase exponentially. But I need a method of accessing that knowledge. The madness key isn't good enough. Its information relies too heavily on me thinking what to ask. But I would have never seen this as a possibility unless it was pointed out to me. Silas knew that he was intelligent, but the strength of humans on Earth wasn't their intelligence, it was their ability to pass on the deductions to others. Their technology wasn't built in a single generation, but rather across many. The wider universe was clearly the same. How many generations of geniuses had passed until now, each one discovering another piece of the world? Silas began to wonder, should he join a guild? Was he even still in a position to join one given what he was about to do and what he would likely have to do in order to get rid of the madness key's hunger? How would he gather the knowledge he needed to truly reach his full potential? The Golden Grove, the Beast Warlord's sanctum, stealing it, legacy. Silas reached forward and snatched the world scepter out of the air with a palm of etherflow. He took a sharp breath, his mind flashing as he began to move through one site after another. Without fail, he found every single person he was looking for. From Sylvia to Ulrich, and then from existences he couldn't even recognize to Lorien herself. But then he paused on something unexpected. Moose. Flowing with a demonic aura, the man rampaged. He truly looked like a monster, standing at almost 9 feet tall now, his muscles bulging with veins that looked more like steel cords writhing beneath his skin. Blood soaked him through, but it was clear that this was blood of his enemies. The power Moose was giving off was substantial, and yet Silas had to double-check to be sure, but it was true. He was nowhere on the quest leaderboard. What was happening here? Moose crushed another enemy and shattered yet another city stele, but as expected, his name didn't appear even now. The large demonic man looked off in a certain direction then began to stalk toward it. Silas' eyes narrowed. That direction, if his memory served, that was where he had seen Sylvia. By now, he knew that Sylvia was the woman Legacy had chosen over him. Now, it seemed that she would clash with this man Silas could have sworn should have died months ago. Just what was happening here, exactly? Chapter 972. Two birds. Silas stared at Moose's movements for a long while. This method of hacking the system was powerful, but there were limitations. The most important of them was mobility. The world scepter needed to be here, attached to the city stele. That meant that if Silas used it, he could teleport instantly to the location he wanted to be at, but if he wanted to use the world scepter again, he would have to rush back to his city from however long the distance away was. Silas had come up with his own solutions to these problems, of course. For one, he didn't care about leveling up his city at all, it was here for this purpose alone. He planned to personally kill off the competition and deal with them that way. That meant that he could just uproot his city. The trouble with this method was that there was a penalty for moving cities, and it would also damage the runes that he had laid down, and he would have to redraw them. Redrawing the runes was easy. The real issue was the energy that he used to activate them on a large scale. That energy was limited, and without finding another equivalent source, Silas knew that he could only do this 4 more times. This was the most flexible of the options. The second option was finding the resources he would need to modify the runes and make this a new, quasi-portable option. But he had no idea where he might find such resources. The obvious answer was the Nexus. He bet that the access he had with a bronze city stele was on a whole other level compared to chaosheir's. But there was also a chance that much like Earth's nexuses, this city stele was limited to what the quest could provide and what other city lords here put up for sale. Depending on the system's whims, this could either be a very, very good thing, or the exact opposite. However, that would require Silas to survey the landscape personally before he could make a choice. And, even if he did do that, how? He had no experience with picking out materials and using his runes on them. Basically, his entire rune master journey was figuring out how to grow powerful enough so that he didn't have to rely on external items, whether that be because he couldn't afford them, didn't have time to gather them, or didn't want the scorned raps to destroy them. These thoughts were complex and seemingly endless, but Silas knew that he was making a pivotal decision right now. Moose was certainly not in his plans. He couldn't let this sort of anomaly just run around without being addressed because it would certainly come back to bite him. But it was precisely because he wasn't in his plans that Silas didn't have an immediate answer for him. Should he waste a teleportation on him or not? The ultimate conclusion was simple. Do it. Since he would have to deal with Sylvia anyway. Why not two birds with one stone? Moose trudged through a land of soil and grass, every step causing the ground to depress. As big as he was, it seemed that his weight was even more exaggerated, as though his bones had been plated with steel. His expression and face made him seem quite dull, but there were what looked almost like shooting stars in the depths of his eyes every time he completed a thought, his brain firing faster and faster these days. Somehow, he was able to tell the exact location of each one of his enemies. From one, to the next, and then to the next, he moved smoothly and without hurry, as though something was pointing him toward them. And that was because that was exactly what was happening. Before his eyes, an arrow only he could see pointed forward. There were no fancy words or descriptions of a mission or quest to complete. But just an arrow. And it was enough. Moose suddenly stopped. There was a flash up ahead and a man appeared right across from him. The arrow that had been slightly skewed to the left suddenly veered back so violently it had to tremble into place once more, locking onto the man right in front of him. Once black and foggy, the arrow began to solidify, glowing a deeper and deeper shade of red until this red began to outline the man himself. Silas stood across from Moose, his eyes narrowing. It was one thing to see the man behind a projected screen, it was another matter entirely to face him in person. The best word that could be used to describe Moose was dense. His body was just solid, thick as a brick wall and no less compact. He was massive, and yet not a single inch of his frame was wasted. Then there was his forehead. Large, almost like a curved steel plate with the two small protrusions on it as though he had been bumped on the head in a perfectly symmetrical pattern. Or, he's growing horns. Silas looked down at Moose's hands, each large enough to wrap all the way around his head and squeeze it to pulp as though a stress ball. The veiny patterns of coursing vascularity somehow seemed like the most obvious sign of strength to Silas. Powerful. From Silas' will alone, disregarding any stats, he knew that the effectiveness of Moose's strength and constitution alone somehow dwarfed even Gogo's. You shouldn't be here, Moose suddenly said, his face reddening slightly. It wasn't out of embarrassment, but instead like his engines were revving. Silas could practically see his heart pumping out of his chest. Silas looked up from the man's hands. He shouldn't be here. Shouldn't Moose be dead? If there was one person who shouldn't be here, it was the man across from him. You're the one that killed Ragnar. Silas suddenly realized something, looking at some of the markings that covered Moose. Boom. The air in front of Silas suddenly warped. Chapter 973. Demonic Will. Silas' head tilted to the side, the air cannon that was Moose's fist missing him. His hair fluttered, but he couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. He knew that they were powerful now, but it certainly shouldn't be enough to make him feel threatened from the air pressure of an attack alone. Even a fighter jet taking off could at most knock a human off his feet if he was taken off guard. Moose's power was great, but not to this extent. His stats would easily have to be 10 times that to succeed. But even then, that would be assuming that Silas' stats didn't also improve. Moose, though, was shocked for his own reason. It wasn't intuitive to dodge an invisible fist at all, but Silas made it look easy. The size, the shape, the direction, even, all changed far too much. Plus, normally, when those across from him felt his aura, their bodies would stiffen at least the slightest bit, making their reactions slower and labored. Why was Silas so relaxed? Had he underestimated this man still? Honestly speaking, he wanted Silas to be the very last he handled for good reason. He was no doubt the very best of the earthlings he had to cull to forge his demon empire, and this was also no doubt the best place. Right before the summoning, in a secluded place where all the heroes of Earth were forcefully gathered. It was the perfect plan. But, what he hadn't ever truly considered was losing. Until now. Oh, Silas only said this word as though he finally understood something. And that he had. Moose had demonic will, and if there was anything Silas had learned about demonic will, it was that its ability to exert influence on the world around them was much greater. But what Silas hadn't considered was what its weaknesses were. When he got demonic will, the strength output of his telekinesis more than doubled despite the fact his will level remained the exact same. But, it seemed that demonic will had its own weaknesses too, that being that it was wild and was difficult to shape. Silas had never noticed because he had will to back up his demonic will. So together, his telekinesis not only had strong ability to exert influence, but he could also freely shape it and mold it to his desires. This was why, other than etherflow, he could freely form fingers, or palms, and grasping hands even from hundreds of meters away. Moose, though, couldn't do this. His air cannons were only mistaken as such by Silas because they were so flimsy. They couldn't even manifest at a distance, they always started from Moose's hands as well. Were they powerful? Yes, even more powerful than if Moose's fists landed on him personally. But so what? Trying to use ranged attacks that he could easily detect while not having the prerequisite speed of a ranged attack was, well, foolish. How could the speed of a fist match up to that of an arrow? Since Silas could detect the pulse of will with ease, he had basically clipped Moose's wings. Silas took a step forward and punched. Moose's gaze flickered as though he was ready for something, but then, bang! The fist landed solidly, right in the middle of his chest. Moose's protective barrier of demonic will shattered, and he took a heavy step back, almost collapsing to the ground. Although he wasn't heavily injured, he was stunned nonetheless. Silas nodded lightly. Moose's constitution was about as shocking as he assumed it to be. But it wouldn't be enough. Silas' body had already pretty much recovered all of his stats, but the irony was that he had only returned to level 20 or so. The cost to raise him to level 50 had cost practically all of Earth's ether, so one could imagine how far he would need to go to unlock things. Luckily, he had had 1 million or so silver genes left over after unlocking Viperman-C. Right now, with his scorned wraps involved, his constitution was no less than Moose's. But, if he added his Scorpion Warlord armor on top of that. Silas' body flashed with a wrapping of violet. He took a strong step forward again, and this time he truly vanished. Moose reacted quickly, but not quickly enough. His strength and constitution were great, but his speed and dexterity, though. That was a completely different story. Moose thought that he had already made up for this with his telekinesis and demonic will, only for those weaknesses to creep up once again. Before Silas, his strong demonic will was worthless. Bang! Silas drove a fist into Moose's gut. The enormous man keeled over, hacking up blood. He felt as though all of his inner organs had been minced and mashed to pieces, his body almost collapsing on him right then and there. How could the gap be so big? Boom! Silas grabbed Moose's hair and drove his face into the ground. His claws sank into Moose's skull, but his eyes narrowed when he met resistance. It was only a moment before Silas realized that the resistance was actually the pads of his own fingers. Moose's skull was so thick that even his elongated claws couldn't make it to the flesh of his brain. No, it's not just that. His bones do get denser the deeper you go too. What are you? The words should have come from Silas, but instead, they came from Moose instead. Silas didn't reply. Of course, he wouldn't have responded to a question like that to begin with. Who had the upper hand and who should be asking questions was obvious. But no, the real reason he didn't respond was because he had gotten a notification that made his eyes narrow and honestly, his heart quake a bit. You have found a demonic envoy. The screen glitched and was replaced by something else. An invitation from Legacy has been extended to you. Please accept at your earliest convenience. Did Legacy just override the system? Chapter 974. Screen. Silas stared at the screen before him for a long while before he finally dismissed it. He was certain that the system had reacted first, but then there was a glitch similar to what he would only see when the madness key interfered with something. And then, a new screen popped up. In truth, it had happened so fast that had Silas not translated things to ancient Ithkal, all he would have seen was the glitch. It was only because he had been able to feel the intentions of the first notification so quickly that he had been able to read even half of it. If not for this, did Legacy not want him to see what was written initially? Silas should have known that it couldn't possibly be that he was lucky enough to run into the one and only item in all of the universe that could interfere with the system. If there was anything his struggles had taught him, it was that there were too many ways to pull the wool over the system's eyes. But this still felt like it was a level above. This was as direct as it came, a level of directness that Silas had only ever seen from the madness key itself. However, this felt more oppressive. The madness key seemed to toe a line, and it punished him for touching on taboos that were likely not decided by it, but likely the system itself. Silas could only speculate, but it felt like the madness key was trying to strike a balance of sorts, while Legacy didn't care for this balance at all, doing as it pleased. Taking a breath, Silas exhaled. But he had only barely grasped his situation here when something maybe equally as surprising happened. His hand slipped and passed right through Moose, slamming against the ground with a bang. He had been holding down quite a bit of pressure to keep the big man restrained and in control, even using his will to stop him from manifesting his own. With his disruption domain active too, Moose couldn't even cast a skill if he wanted to. So how the hell had he escaped? Silas looked around, his visualization spreading out, but in the entire 2 kilometers. Aside from Sylvia and her city, he couldn't find even a single trace of Moose. What? Wasn't this quest supposed to be inescapable? Did Moose just leave it completely? Or was he able to escape it precisely because he never appeared on the leaderboard to begin with? Silas frowned as he stood to his feet. Honestly speaking, he wasn't worried about Moose. What he was curious. If he was correct, the loss of his woodland territory was definitely related to this man. Is he the reason the Emperor disappeared from the list? And now he's going after Sylvia. A coincidence, or was he only targeting the people of Earth to begin with? Interesting. Silas couldn't help but wonder if this was related to the mysterious first race of Earth or not. But logically, that didn't make sense. The system wanted nothing more than to revive that race, but the system also hated demons to the core for whatever reason. How could Moose be related to that race if his being was hated by the system? Something wasn't adding up. Silas stood to his full height. It seems that he had accidentally gotten himself caught up in something again. There was likely no avoiding this legacy meeting, but now Moose was also gone once again. The good news, though, was that if Legacy was interested, they were unlikely to destroy their branch. The bad news was that if Legacy took interest, Earth would be under a lot more scrutiny all of a sudden. But this was also an opportunity. The stores of knowledge Legacy should have would likely be far beyond his wildest imaginations. If that was the case, the answer to his plight might be forthcoming. Silas crouched over Sylvia's city wall, watching her struggle as his tail slowly swayed behind him. Every time it did, another arc of green lightning would curl through the air, shattering one of her spawns, or her defenses. It wasn't that he was playing around, he wasn't. He was on a time crunch. Instead, after seeing Sylvia's set up, he knew that he didn't have to take the unnecessary risk of rushing in. Sylvia was intelligent. She knew that she wouldn't have the same advantages as others. So after she figured out what Silas had, her approach was very different. She forgot about gene collecting for the most part and focused all her attention on building up a single city. Given that it had only been a day, she had done quite well. There were buffs, countless siege weapons, and her spawns were well organized. She had clearly abandoned culture and focused completely on military might, and it had paid off. Between the buffs, the battle against her was tougher than even the first wave of the Bronze City Stele challenge had been. Unfortunately, not only was Silas far stronger since then, but he was far less restricted as well. In this case, he had nothing to protect. He was the one that could stand high in the skies and pelt down attacks. This was how he cleared the wall and now stood on it. The moment he accomplished this, his will flooded the protective formations and turned them to his advantage, using Sylvia's defenses against her. Silas' tail flickered. Bang! An arrow rippled away against a barrier just 6 inches from his face, but Silas didn't even look at it, a beam coming from his tail and colliding with the archer that sent it. They trembled once before blooming flowers of emerald crystal coated them. And then, there was no one by Sylvia left. Huffing out heavy breaths, she stood in the midst of a forest of green emerald humans, looking up toward where Silas crouched. Even now, there wasn't a sense of defeat in her eyes, but deep inside, she knew what the reality was. Chapter 975. Pressed. Silas held Sylvia's neck in his hand, holding her up as though she weighed not much more than a straw doll. There was a look of calm in her eyes, but Silas could tell the difference. The difference between a woman who didn't fear death versus one that didn't think she would die in the first place. He had intimately felt the difference before. Sometimes he even wondered if his own current indifference toward death was only because he was gaining more confidence in his own abilities rather than the fact he had truly gotten over that fear. That difference seemed inconsequential, but it was all too important to him. Sylvia wasn't so calm because she was ready to die. She just thought that she was too valuable to fall here. Honestly speaking, she was probably right. She was easily among the top 10 talents of Earth, an existence that would be integral to their future rise. Silas, though, hadn't decided. The other question was if the choice was even in his hands. Did he have to kill everyone on the quest leaderboard for him to win? The odd part about this quest was that the end goal wasn't obvious. If it was to conquer the entire world, maybe even killing everyone wouldn't be enough, as he would need to raise a city stele past the Empire level to do that. But Silas didn't think that would be necessary. He had a pretty good guess as to what it would take, and if he was correct, he could do it even without killing these enemies first. It was just that killing them ahead of time would make things far easier on him, so it was only logical to do so. Though he said all of this, it wasn't certain. He could very well be wrong, which was why killing someone he could kill ahead of time instead of dragging them around only seemed like the logical thing to do. He shook his head. Earth had so few warriors, and given the challenges that were coming, he would be arrogant to believe that he could do it all on his own. Scylla's hand squeezed down. Sylvia's eyes widened in shock, not believing it until she felt her own windpipe shatter to pieces, squeezed down and then skewered by her own spinal cord. It seemed that he would just have to be arrogant, then. He didn't even bother to have Nosfaline take control of her. It would be a waste of resources. With the situation Earth was in now, it was best if there was just one voice and no one he had to worry about. Did he care about Sylvia herself and the threat she posed to him? Not at all, but he wouldn't be able to be on Earth all the time, especially not with what he had planned very soon. The only way forward was a clean sweep. Since Emperor Iapir had died, why not kill some more? Silas was about to leave when he paused. After some thought, he used Extricate on Sylvia. There was no way that he could risk pushing Taboo Bond to level 50 for her potential, but there was something else that he was interested in. After a while, he pulled it out. A unique gene. A silver unique gene at that. Oh, this should have come from a silver gene crystal. It gave her enough slots for 30 silver genes. The unique gene had been paired with the gene crystal. From what Silas could tell, the gene crystal that Sylvia had used must have had a capacity of at least 300 or so. But how did she gather 300 silver genes? And how does she have a 30 silver limit, and yet only one silver gene? Something wasn't adding up. It didn't make sense that she could do the former but not the latter. One possibility was that unlike Silas, who would freely swap his genes as he pleased, others were locked into theirs, so Sylvia was a lot more selective. But even then, with a 300 silver gene capacity, there was no doubt that she had to accumulate many different sorts of silver genes to make it. There was no way that in all that variety she hadn't been able to find anything that suited her. There were only 3 possibilities that Silas could think of. The first was that this was a very recent addition and she didn't even have the chance to accumulate others. The second was that there was a secret method that she was working on that Silas didn't understand. Maybe she was already near her gene stat limit even with silver genes, and it was useless to waste more on her if she couldn't later take him out. This second reason was the flimsiest of them. As for the third, Silas felt that it was probably the correct answer and one that made his gaze blaze. Single quote ellipsis. The gene crystal was something she traded for, maybe from a nexus of legacy, and it likely came preloaded with everything she needed. There was a good reason Silas felt like this. This silver gene was so generic. It didn't carry the, well, uniqueness that was so common of unique genes. Maybe it was the hints his rune spark mastery was giving him about it, but it smelled of mass production, as though it was slotted to be given to many people. As for in this case, it was designed first and foremost to increase the slots of silver genes one could accept into their bodies, and the boost to speed and dexterity it gave was secondary. This seemed like a silver gene perfectly designed for an assassin. Most rune masters would see it that way as well. Silas, however, saw through it to a deeper level. It wasn't special at all. But because it wasn't special, there was, ironically, something unique about it. Silas didn't have to bank on a 50% chance of integrating with it at all. Without hesitation, he pressed it to his chest. Chapter 976. Foundation. Name, Silas Grimblade. Species, Human Simioid F. Affiliation, Grimblade lineage. Class, Throne of Glassvolt heir, legendary. Class, Junior primate, fragmented. Profession, Vipermancer, FFF+. Profession, Runeworth, FFF+. Level, 50. Coins, 1377 F. Titles, A Forged Will, Progenitor Professional, Palms of Fate, Grade Slayer, System Rebel, Legendary Tamer, Skill Progenitor, Classic Dungeon Crawler, Woodland Warlord, Glass Desert Warlord, Glass Monkey Slayer, Woodland Spider Queen Slayer, Madness Conqueror, FF, Common Arts Enthusiast, F, A Patient Stalker, F. Physical, 13,966. Greater than, Strength, 6,549. Greater than, Constitution, 14,215. Greater than, Dexterity, 17,549. Greater than, Speed, 17,549. Mental, 21,190. Greater than, Intelligence, 19,151. Greater than, Wisdom, 24,421. Greater than, Charisma, 19,999. Will, 19,999. Greater than, Charisma, 19,999. Will, 19,999. Luck, 2,133. Gene state, flexible. Fragmented genes, voice of a king, F. Common genes, 20, strength, F, 20, constitution, F, 20, dexterity, F, 20, speed, F, 20, intelligence, F, 20, wisdom, F, 20, will, F. Bronze genes, enchanted scribe, F, 40, strength, F, 40, constitution, F, 40, dexterity, F, 40, speed, F, 40, intelligence, F, 40, wisdom, F, 40, charisma, F, 40, will, F. Silver genes, Etherflow, F, Grimblade lineage, F, touch of speed, F. Touch of speed. Pace and movement, natural and flowing. Your fast twitch is the stuff of legends, acceleration and deceleration coming as naturally as breathing to you. Knees of steel and flexibility of the ages, you not only have speed, you command it. Plus 3000 wisdom, plus 3000 dexterity, plus 3000 speed, silver. The gap is so large. This was just a mass-produced gene crystal for a unique silver gene formed by at best 300 or so silver genes. From Scylla's understanding, on a scale of silver gene crystals, this was actually on the lower end of the spectrum. For context, Scylla's maxed out, 200 capacity bronze crystal had only given him plus 80 or so in each stat point. This was 40 times that. This went to paint just how large the difference between real silver genes and bronze genes were. Or maybe, more accurately, real silver genes and the ones he had on his person right now. He never thought that his speed and dexterity would ever surpass his constitution, but he could understand why. It seemed that this silver gene had alleviated him of his gene stat limit. Judging by his mental going over 19,999, this had to have been what happened. By doing so, the state of wealth his ridiculous number of bronze genes granted him finally kicked in, activating all at once and raising his body to a new level. Unfortunately, this only triggered for wisdom, speed, and dexterity. But it was enough to give his stats a completely new look. However, it also put his body in a state of deficit as well. He almost felt empty right now, and he knew that his natural healing factor had also taken a significant dip. He no longer had any potential to tap into because he had stepped into an entirely new bracket. Silver genes, he needed them. And he would have them. After he finished his rampage. Next. Ulrich stood in silence. It hadn't been more than half an hour or so since Scylla's abrupt rise on the leaderboards and he had done the only logical thing. Contact Lorien through the Nexus. The both of them were quite aware of the estrangement that existed now, but Ulrich took the initiative to contact her to make it clear that he would be willing to settle things with her later so long as they dealt with Scylla's first. What he didn't expect was to not get a response at all. It should have made him feel completely enraged, but there was a chilling calm in his eyes right now. She was smart. As much as Lorien thought she knew about that treasure, he knew far more. If she listened to his plans, once they finished taking out Scylla's, she would certainly suffer. Since she knew that she couldn't possibly outsmart him in this respect, she chose to stay away. Maybe he had been too eager, but that was fine. Just because he seemed to be lagging behind Lorien in terms of genes collected, didn't mean that he was losing. There was only one way to clear this quest properly, and that was by becoming the progenitor of this world. The most straightforward way to accomplish this was by lighting the progenitor flame. However, making it to the center of a world when there wasn't a convenient dungeon or bridge formed like there had been on Earth was a nightmare. The ease with which Scylla's made it to Earth's core was ironically thanks to all of those scheming against him and his world. If not for their machinations and the linkage of two dungeons across opposite sides of the world, making it there would have been impossible without extraordinary means. The second method was far vaguer, and that was to gain acknowledgement of the world. If Ulrich had the ether treasure Lorien stole, he would have confidence in succeeding within just a month. Given Lorien's lack of familiarity with the treasure, he believed it would probably take her around double or triple that time. But either way, he was certainly on a time crunch right now. If he wanted to surpass her and claim the acknowledgement of this world, ironically enough defeating Scylla's just might be a massive shortcut. However, what the others were mistaken about was the method in which you would do this. What a world needed wasn't a badass, one-man army. Worlds were intelligent, they knew such a thing had diminishing returns. Believing in one person's talent could only lead you so far. Of course, when someone tilted the balance so much, a world would have no choice but to acknowledge it. This was especially so for a world that had been as desperate as Earth. It could be said that this was why he was given a chance to become a progenitor so easily. But this was also why the progenitor quest Earth decided for Scylla's was against the geniuses of other worlds as well. The difficulty was increased precisely because Scylla's was usually the last sort of progenitor a world would choose. Prove himself here, and Earth would accept its fate. Ulrich, though, wasn't aiming to please a world. At least not yet. While Scylla's was fighting for his progenitor position, the rest of them were fighting for something else, the right to elevate a world to silver grade. Why would a Thriskai like him even need such a thing? The number of silver worlds they controlled in the Sky Galaxy alone were in the dozens. The truth was that giving a world such a boost would be an easy way to gain a progenitor quest of their own. This reflected the true difficulty of becoming a progenitor. Elevating a bronze world to a silver one might get you a progenitor quest. However, Ulrich had no thoughts of failure. He would succeed. His branch of the Thriskai had been suppressed for too long. If they birthed a progenitor, everything would change. And he would be that man. What could two ants of inferior races do to him? He would show them that in the world of genes, foundation was everything. Ulrich's city rumbled and began to rise into the skies. Chapter 977. Come. Lorien watched as Ulrich's notification faded away, her expression not changing. She had no intention of trusting that man regardless of the circumstances, she never had. The problems of the mist race had to be solved by the mist race. She had never agreed with using the seed of other races to try and fix things. If their ancestors could get them this power through genes, then they could climb their way out through genes as well. These shoddy attempts would only make them subservient to others, their wombs enslaved to the powerhouses they chose to bed. That wasn't the future she wanted for herself. Of course, the mist race wasn't nearly so foolish as Lorien's thoughts were making it seem. There was a reason that Ulrich hadn't just jumped on the opportunity to bed her. There would certainly be a great number of strings attached, mostly related to the unique sexual methods of her race and what it did to men they took in. But even that was only a stopgap measure. It forced them to selectively target their husbands, choosing men that were powerful, but not too powerful, men that had backgrounds, but not shocking ones that couldn't be overcome. In this respect, Ulrich was perfect. He was a Thriskai, but not quite. He was of the branch of an inferior wing of the race. This so-called Sky Galaxy wasn't even truly called Sky Galaxy. Instead, it was known as Sky 11331 Galaxy. Sky was simply a prefix the true main Thriskai gave to the meager strands of their bloodline, the three moniker reserved for those they truly saw as one of their own. Why would she ever willingly choose to be with such an inferior man? She had ambitions beyond this world, and that would start with elevating the main mist race world to silver and becoming its progenitor. That would just be the start. But right now, Silas was standing in her way. The question was, how could she make him move? Lorien's eyes narrowed, her mind churning with a great number of thoughts. Eventually, she slowly turned to the ether treasure that had gotten her all the way here. She wondered if she should take the risk. If Ulrich thought her to be so ignorant of this treasure, he would be sorely mistaken. In fact, she probably knew more about it than even he did, which was why she hadn't activated it just yet while he would go on and rush it. While within a month she could certainly accumulate what she needed to successfully become a progenitor of this world, it would also limit the rewards she received. That was because something similar to what happened to Earth would reoccur here. Maybe that was something Ulrich could withstand because he had the Thriskai, or at least a branch, backing him. But she couldn't take such a blow. This was just step one for her. The next step required weathering the inevitable storm that would come when the galaxy turned their blades on her. The rewards of this quest. She needed them. However, success, even an immature, impotent one, was far better than failure. She hesitated. Silas stared at the vacant hole in front of him. The city that should have been there was no longer there, and instead, when he looked up into the skies, he saw a mass as heavy as a mountain looming. The mountain was divided into rings, each one layered with its own powerful formation. The smallest was the easiest to decipher and withstand, but each subsequent one exponentially increased in strength. At the highest level, the 10th and final ring that was of the city wall itself, bolstered by tall steel walls already. High on those very walls, Ulrich peered down from above. His expression didn't have the slightest change, but looking at Silas who was so far below him, it only felt natural. What was that Silas had said? The next time he saw him he would kill him. Something to that effect. No matter the circumstances, no matter the cost. Something like that. He had even foolishly made an oath about it. Ulrich could have activated this formation long ago. This inverted mountain was one of the most famous structures of the Thriskai. In fact, the sky character of their name was a translation from an ancient language, quite literally translating to heaven. They were the dome above all, and they tended to build all of their structures in the skies as well. This formation, the inverted sky formation, was not only powerful, but it was mass-producible and easily replicated so long as one understood the underlying principles. While Lorien and Silas were rushing ahead with genes, he had spent the majority of his time building this very formation. When the time came, not only would it give him shockingly powerful defenses, he would always have the terrain advantage, and he would have mobility that other cities couldn't fathom. Most city lords in the early stages couldn't even leave off to far distances unless they triggered a quest of some sort. But the Thriskai, they never had this problem at all. Ulrich clasped his hands behind his back and then sent a casual glance to those manning a few formations before turning to Silas once again. This could only end one of two ways. Either Silas would fall like Icarus or he would be burned by his own oath. In the end, he could only blame his own arrogance. In the Sky Galaxy, who could ever possibly stand above the Thriskai? Silas calmly looked at things from below. Standing there, he hadn't moved an inch. He could easily fly into the skies. Maybe that was something Ulrich knew, or maybe not. But why should he have to? Come down here. Bang! There was a slight pulse from Silas' eyes as the first formation unraveled, collapsing in on itself. It had only just fallen when a second pulse came from his irises, the tendrils of various greens writhing against one another. Bang! Chapter 978. System Oath. Ulrich's eyes widened. By the time he reacted, there were only the 9th and 10th formations left, but the city in the skies had already tilted far off to the side. For some reason, his eyes locked onto Silas one more time, just for him to finally look at him through the last formation. He didn't move a single inch, as though he couldn't see the city falling toward him from above. Bang! The last formation shattered. The descent was almost slow at first. Until it instantly wasn't. Like an anchor falling from above, it didn't just fall, it plummeted. Harsh winds lashed out, rushing to get out of its way, a whistling that sounded more akin to the howls of countless whales echoing across the distance. Silas' dense hair blew back, his pants pressing against his body so firmly that it seemed as though they might rip at the seams. Boom! Silas didn't take a single step as the earth beneath him collapsed, shattering to pieces and then riding up in tsunami-like waves. As though a nuke had gone off, the region for several kilometers was leveled to the ground, and yet there Silas stood. An abyss lay below him, but as though to prove a point, he hovered above it, the remains of the city having long since collapsed beneath him. The once tall steel walls had collapsed. The structures, once defined and quite majestic despite the youth of the city, had no redeeming characteristics left. Endless rubble and scraps of silvery steel were the only outlines of what had once been, even a vast majority of them were in heaps of nothing. Almost no one at all survived. Ulrich had easily been half a kilometer in the skies, a distance that should have been enough for him to act with impunity. But it was also a height that, without other means, F grades couldn't possibly survive a fall from. The number of people that could use their telekinesis to fly was limited. But worse than that, the further away from the surface of a world you were, the more difficult flight was. Telekinesis worked by exerting your will onto the world. If there was no world to exert your will on, then how could you fly? If you wanted to do something like that, you would need a will so powerful that it could stand independent of outside influences, a will not reliant on the relativity of its existence, but rather a will in the truest sense. But a will of such a level, it was unfathomable even to the current Silas. That said, something like flying half a kilometer above the surface of a world was easy for the current Silas. But attacking from a distance of half a kilometer was likewise well within his range. With his current luck, projecting his will an entire 2 kilometers was more than within his capabilities. What was half a kilometer worth to him? Silas took a step forward, walking across the air as though it was no different from flat ground. The echoes of a cough and shifting metal and brick panels echoed, but by the time the head-producing said sounds appeared, they were only in time to find a clawed hand reaching down. Ulrich's throat was snatched, his airways cut off. His body was an absolute mess. Without will of a forging level at the very least, flying half a kilometer above the surface was impossible. Ulrich had floundered for the first several hundred meters, and by the time his own telekinesis started working properly, he was going so fast that it was hard to exert the power he needed to slow himself down properly. He barely managed to focus on slowing himself down enough that he didn't die on impact, only to be forced to withstand the equivalent of a nuclear bomb going off. A meteor of this size, if falling from the highest stratosphere, could easily destroy a world. An F-grade existence like him, especially with his stats restrained, was lucky to even be alive right now. His body was in shambles, he didn't have a single bone that wasn't broken or a single piece of flesh that wasn't marred in some way. Notifications about the destruction of his city rang out in his ears and flashed in his eyes continuously, and yet all he could see was that pair of emerald eyes right before him, staring down at him. In that moment, for the first time in his life, Ulrich truly felt inferior in a way he couldn't describe. He hadn't felt this way as a branch member of his family, he hadn't felt this way facing off against the powerhouses of his clan, he hadn't even felt this way while facing E grades or the rare D grades. But right now, facing someone who should have been beneath his notice, he felt it more intimately than ever before, so much so that what was nothing more than a fraction of a second felt like a lifetime to him. Crack. Silas wasn't staring at Ulrich alone, he wasn't wasting his time trying to assert dominance or prove who was correct all the while. He didn't even bother to mention his oath and how he was fulfilling it. The instant he picked up Ulrich's neck, he snapped, crushing it to pieces so thoroughly and with such force that the Thriskai's flesh became pulp and he was decapitated. Ulrich's head rolled off of the top of Silas' fist, falling to the ground in a silent splat that echoed with a grotesque tinge to it. Silas was indifferent to it all, but it seemed that his demonic will was not. There was a surge inside of him as though a chain had finally been broken. Unfettered and rumbling, his will spread out, pressing down onto the world with a strength that exceeded 100,000 pounds of force. Interesting. Silas thought. It seemed that system oaths were a method of improving his will rapidly. He didn't expect a reward for this, but he would surely take it. He lifted a foot and smashed Ulrich's head to pulp. Chapter 979. Absolutely not. Silas threw what remained of Ulrich's corpse into the madness key. He knew that there was no point in trying to use extricate, not yet. He had experience trying to take genes from the sylphs, and that hadn't ended well. Even a race like the sylphs could protect their genes, let alone the Thriskai. The attempt wasn't worth the waste. But, Scylla's bet that if there was a way to place gene locks, then there was a way to remove them too. For now, though. Scylla bent down and plucked out 3 balls of flesh. After observing them for a while, he crushed 2 of them and tossed them away. It seemed that at least for Ulrich, the only important eye was the third. The other 2 were too simple. He would need this for his eye refinement method, which was the real reason he crushed Ulrich's skull. Otherwise, he wouldn't have even bothered to waste the energy. Unfortunately, it was just one, and it was still just a single piece of what he needed, as several resources needed to be compiled as well. But, it was a start. Plus, unlike with the genes, he wouldn't have to worry about unlocking it first. It seemed that there was only one more enemy that he had to be wary of now. The only real enemy that he had been gunning for from the very beginning. As powerful as Ulrich's lineage was, Scylla's had never cared much for him. If he hadn't pissed him off so much, Scylla's would have only bothered to remember him in passing. But at the time, the situation with Nissa was already close to pulling him over the edge. Ulrich adding fuel to the flames was something he only had himself to blame for. Now, though, Scylla's felt much more relaxed. If he was facing off against Lorien alone, he was certain that she wouldn't stand a chance. But given the intelligence of that woman, the odds that things would be so simple were low. He had only just had the thought when he frowned. His head snapped up to the skies. Reflected in his gaze, the mesh of reality appeared before him, dancing between the various runes. His frown deepened. Something is restraining the world. It's almost whining. It's being oppressed by something. Flashes of insight connected the dots for Scylla's. She's trying to take control of the world right now. I was right. Scylla's didn't move immediately. A treasure powerful enough to do this, even if it was just a projected quest world, wasn't something that could be taken so lightly. If this treasure could have been used to become a progenitor directly of any normal world, then why would she even bother to come here? However, because this was a world projected by the system, it had its flaws and it could be taken advantage of in this way. Of course, Scylla's only reached this conclusion because he assumed that everyone was here for a chance to become a progenitor like he was. While he was right in a sense, it wasn't exactly as he assumed it to be. Regardless, the conclusion was correct. But what he didn't know was exactly how he should go about stopping it. Like he had said, any treasure that could work on this level and scope would certainly have great power. He didn't have a city backing him like Ulrich did, and he somehow doubted that Lorien would have her city hanging in the sky for him to conveniently knock down either. What do I do? Scylla's frowned, standing as he felt the world slowly bending as though it might collapse any moment now. If he waited any longer, he might not even be able to teleport to Lorien directly. The world scepter relied on the world itself to function. If the world was compromised too much, or under the control of someone else, the world wouldn't even have the authority to allow a world treasure to work in the first place. At that point, the scepter would become a useless pile of junk metal. How was he going to counter a treasure like this one? Once again, he was running into the same problem he always did. Lack of information, lack of understanding. Would he really have to fly in blind and just hope for the best? No, I do have a method. Calculations danced in Scylla's mind, but he couldn't complete them in time. Or rather, he knew he wouldn't. Summoning the world scepter and city stele once again, he poured genes into it to activate the city once more and establish its foothold before he vanished once again. Lorien stood in a room with her city stele, a treasure in the shape of a single white feather with sparse furs of gold dispersed throughout hanging above it. There was a sigh in her heart, but she knew that she was making the correct decision. According to what she knew, the only way for Scylla's to have accumulated so many silver genes at the same time was by having earned a bronze city stele. She had no idea how he had managed to clear one so early on, likely all on his own, but what it told her was that she had vastly underestimated his strength. But more important than that, if Scylla's didn't choose a city stele to start, he almost certainly chose the gene elixir. That meant that unlike the rest of them, he only needed to gather double the genes to unlock what he needed. Even after spawning an alchemist, she was still working with inflexible gene elixirs, meaning she had to gather 10 times as much to unlock what she needed. The conclusion was obvious: she would lose if she wasn't willing to make sacrifices. This had to be her sacrifice whether she wanted it or not. Her head snapped in a certain direction. Single quote ellipsis. He's here. She had only just had the thought when her eyes opened wide. What is that? No, absolutely not. Lorian's gaze turned malevolent as her body disappeared in a cloud of pink mist. Chapter 980. Inside and Out. Silas pulled on his wool as hard as he dared, pouring it all into larger and larger rune formations. The Africor monix was simply the gift that kept on giving. In this situation, if he needed a method of stopping Lorien from overtaking the world, then didn't he just need to disconnect her from it? Separating the ether treasure from this projected world was a far simpler task than separating the glass city from the purview of the system. Silas was not only far stronger than the three monarchs combined, but his task was far easier. How could he not succeed? Originally, he hadn't thought of this solution because the situations weren't perfectly analogous. But after he ran out of options and came to this conclusion, it seemed only natural. Back then, he hadn't been able to get close to the three monarchs because of the sheer control they had over the region. Wasn't control exactly what he needed right now? It was also for this reason that Lorien had been so confident in rendering Silas' rune master capabilities useless. But now, she wouldn't have such an option anymore. Bang! Silas' pupils constricted. Fast. A woman, with hair of mist pink, looking more goddess than human, manifested before him in a line of rosé. She practically painted the skies with her wool, her palm appearing at Silas' chest in an instant. Silas had yet to fully take control of the region and was still locked in a wrestling match with the ether treasure. At most, he had gained about 10% of the control back, but that still left Lorien with a majority of the control over the region. His rune forging ability was severely limited, and even with the sharp increase to his wisdom recently, the control of this formation took up practically all of it. But not everything. Silas' eyes sharpened. His current stats were far beyond Lorien's. Her ability to control the world was far beyond his own. Now it was just a matter of who would win this tug of war. And he had no doubt in his mind that it would be him. He had lost to this woman once before. Unprepared, and thrust into a world far beyond his understanding, he had struggled, only to be crushed. Once again, he was unprepared, not even having expected his progenitor quest to involve others in this way. But it didn't matter. This world didn't allow for excuses, it didn't allow for ignorance, it didn't allow for weakness. He would win. And he would win no matter what. His will flourished. Bang! Lorien thought she was fast enough to catch Silas off guard, but she was very wrong. The two crossed palms in the center of the sky, a complex magic circle beneath their feet. A whirlwind of pink and a cascade of green clashed in the air, their wills practically taking tangible form. But Lorien's was quickly swallowed up, unable to withstand Silas until it made a roaring comeback, supported by the world around her. Silas pulled again, stripping another percentage point to his side. Lorien's expression changed once more. She knew that she had to end this quickly. When they first met, her will was so much more powerful than Silas' own. But since then, Silas had undergone 3 upgrades while she had yet to have even a single one. She was still stuck at shaping wool and Silas had left her far behind at forged. The difference between them was palpable. Without the help of the ether treasure, she would have long since lost. But by extension, if she hadn't been so focused on raising the ether treasure to begin with, her stats wouldn't be so limited either and she would have been able to put up a far better fight. Ultimately, they had both just taken different paths. Whoever was stronger, whoever was more right, would be the one that won. Lorien took one heavy step back before her palms flared out. She picked out Silas' weakness immediately. Unlike her ether treasure that was mostly working on its own, Silas was controlling this formation personally. Every time she attacked it, he would have to reform the runes. And every time he tugged, it would have to come from his own will. He was quickly draining his strength at a pace far beyond herself, and because she had reacted so quickly, he was still far from success. She would take advantage. Chi. 2 blades appeared in her palms. She wasn't even adept at dual wielding, but it was the path she chose nonetheless, assaulting the formation around her. Bang! Glass shields appeared in the path of her blades as Silas took a step through the skies. She might have her advantages, but he had his own. His telekinesis was far stronger than hers, and in the air. He was the predator. Lorien's gaze flickered and she dispersed into mist, dodging out of the way and appearing a frozen 10 meters from Scylla's with her blades already raised once again. Scylla's became a bolt of lightning, activating glass vault shift as though he knew exactly where she would appear. His attack had been nothing more than a feint. He understood the abilities of the mist race inside and out by now. While the strongest of them with the greatest control could freely shift from mist to corporeal, none of them could attack in the former form other than to use their will directly. Lorien no longer dared to clash with his will directly, so how could she dare to attack in that form? Every time she took it, she would use it to evade in this battle. That was something he could guarantee. In that case, he only needed to follow exactly where her will locked onto and appear there first. Something his insight into the mesh of reality made as easy as breathing. He could see the shifts in the runes in the region through time and space. The instant Lorien had the intention to move, he could get there before she could. Bang! Scylla's fist drove right into her gut the instant she took form, his knee shattering her nose when she keeled over. Blood splattered around the skies.